Hey everyone, I'm back from my holiday and today I've got another episode in my Piano Questions Answered series for you. Now today's question is a really interesting one and it comes from a comment that Elizabeth Welch posted on one of my recent videos. It was the pop piano improvisation walkthrough that I published a few weeks ago and that you might have seen. Don't worry if you haven't, by the way, because we'll be going back over the stuff there. Now this is what Elizabeth has to say. I have a question on this exercise. I'm having fun playing around with it, but do you have any tips for ending an improvisation? I find that I get stuck in a loop a little with progressions like this, and I'm having a hard time establishing a sense of the ending of the song. It might just have to do with the dynamics or something, but are there certain chords that lend themselves to a more nicely resolved ending? So what we're going to do in this tutorial is look at various ways of ending improvisations. Now we'll start off discussing pop piano type loops like the one that Elizabeth was commenting on, but then we'll move on to thinking about some other styles like jazz and blues in particular. I'm going to pick up on some of the stuff that Elizabeth specifically mentions like chords and dynamics and teach you some pretty straightforward ways you can wrap up your own improvisations. Now with this one, I'm going to be assuming that I can use technical language reasonably freely and that you know a reasonable amount about chords, loops, progressions, scales, keys, that kind of stuff. If you're not kind of there yet with that technical knowledge, then just subscribe to my channel using the little red button down in the right hand corner of the video window and check out some of the piano tutorials I have on those more basic subjects. Okay, let's get going. So a good place to start is the improvisation from the tutorial that Elizabeth originally commented on. As I say, it doesn't matter if you haven't seen that tutorial, but if you would like to watch it, I'll put a link to it in the description text underneath this video. Now what we were doing in that tutorial was basically working on a pop piano improvisation based on a 32-bar chord progression, okay, and that looked a little bit like this. What I'm going to do now is just take the final 8 bars, the final 8 measures of that progression and improvise through it a few times, and each time I'll bring it to an ending, okay, and try and give it a natural sounding ending. Then when I've done that, I'll talk through some of the techniques that I was using. Okay, here we go. Notice how I was really slowing down there towards the end. We'll talk about that in a second. Now this time I'm going to add a little bit of a coda, a little extra improvisation tacked on the end to round things up. Now the fundamental principle we're working with here is that we always need to end our progressions on the tonic chord, the chord that shares its name with the key we're playing in, which in this case is F major. Now this progression actually makes things pretty easy for us because it ends on the tonic anyway, and most progressions in fact end on the tonic. Things get a little bit more complicated if you're working with a looped progression that's designed to repeat over and over, because those tend to have as their final chord a dominant or a dominant type chord, a chord that's designed to take you back to the beginning of the progression. If you come across that kind of situation, you need to resolve that instability and find your way back to the tonic, and you're pretty well forced to create some new chords, to create a coda on the end there to give it a natural ending. But from our point of view here, the progression does the hard work for us, so we don't need to invent any new chords, we don't need to invent a coda if we don't want to. And the first couple of times I played through back then, I just used the chords of the progression. No different chords, no additional chords were needed there. What I relied on instead were three factors, okay? Factor number one was pitch, how high or how low I was playing. Factor number two was dynamics, how loud or soft I was playing. And factor number three was kind of harder to pin down, expression, okay, the particular expression, the particular way I was playing. And what I was doing mostly, and as I say, particularly in the first two examples, was combining those three to kind of create a sense of an ending, to use Elizabeth's words, a feeling of finality. Let's think about pitch first. You can create a really good sense of an ending just by going lower or higher than the typical range that you've been playing in on the piano keyboard, okay? I actually did that in the first couple of endings, and it's a really nice, really easy effect. So if mostly you're playing around here, then just by coming up here, you give that kind of final sense of change, that you know, just that kind of musical touch that says this is a bit different. This is the end of the piece. You can go the other way as well. Obviously, you can go down. Okay. Just a couple of important things to bear in mind there. If you go a long way down the piano, you've got lots of audible overtones in the notes that you're playing, and they'll fight with each other if you're not careful and give you a really kind of muddy sound. The way to avoid that is to basically not play big chunky chords down here, okay? Keep things nice and spaced out. Okay, single note if you have to. Conversely, if you're going up the piano, then you need to fill in more tones because there are fewer audible overtones, okay? And you get a really nice sound, okay, just by playing a full chord up there. Okay, so that's pitch. Second, we have dynamics, our louds and our softs. Now, a very common thing to do, especially in this kind of ballad style piano playing, is to use a diminuendo, a getting softer in the last few notes or chords of the improvisation. And that works both high and low, actually. Okay, it's particularly effective if you combine the dynamics with the pitch change, yeah? So I often like to go high and quiet. Just a nice contrast, again gives us a really good sense of an ending. What I'm also dropping in there was our third factor, expression. Now, as I said, expression can be kind of hard to pin down. It very much comes down to the particular feeling, the particular emotion you put into the music. But its most practical manifestation is often ritenuto. A ritenuto, or a rit as musicians often call it, is a slowing down towards the end of a piece. And it can sound really cool. So there, I'm changing pitch, I'm getting quieter, and I'm slowing down, okay? Now, the problem with the ritenuto is that although it kind of sounds relaxed and gentle, you need to be really, really, really disciplined about it. The biggest problem that beginners tend to have with rits is that they kind of come out uneven. Okay, it's got to be a gradual slowing down. And if you get your ritenuto slightly wrong, or if you make too much of a meal out of it, or you string it out too much, or at least if you do that in every single song you play, then it can kind of spoils it a little bit. A well-judged ritenuto, a well-judged slowing down, okay, is quite delicate and quite subtle. Ritenutos are cool, but less is more, if you see what I mean. So practice your slowing down, practice your rits if you're going to use them, and don't get too lavish with them, at least at first. It can be really tempting to kind of go overboard and try and be really emotional and theatrical. And very often it's much more effective if you just keep it a little bit under control. The other thing you can do, as I've said, is to create a coda, yeah, a little snippet of music that's added on to the end of your improvisation, which kind of draws out the ending to kind of give it a clearer sense of having finished, okay? Now, sometimes, as I said, you'll be forced to use a coda, especially if you're using a looped chord progression. But most of the time, it'll come down to your musical judgment. If you feel that the ending needs kind of more of a big statement, then that is the time to use a coda. Now, there are various ways of going about creating codas. You can. Or typically you would use musical material that you have already used in the improvisation in a slightly different form. Okay, so if I just play the last sort of couple of bars of our progression and then a little coda on the end. Okay, so our main progression came to the end with the G minor 7, the C7 and the F chord, but then I came up here and again notice that I'm making use of the change of pitch and started playing around with this little motif, which I have been using quite a lot in that improvisation, and then got quieter and slower and used all the other techniques I was talking about, expression and change of dynamics, change of pitch, all the rest, to create a really clear sense of ending. Even simpler than that, you can just repeat the final two bars. Okay, various things you can do. Now the trick with codas, as kind of with using expression to create a sense of an ending, is to be quite careful in your judgment, because you have a lot of options. You can repeat things, you can restate material, you can do all kinds of different stuff, but you need to not get carried away. And I think it's always best with codas to err on the side of being too short rather than stringing it out too much. Yeah. Again, if you kind of improvise a coda, and you'll find if you judge it a bit wrong, it can kind of take the shine off the end of your piece. Yeah. So just think carefully about it, be a little bit restrained, don't hang around, don't linger, err on the side of brevity. Okay, so what I want to do now is to take those basic ideas and think about them in the context of a couple of other genres, specifically jazz and blues. And the reason I want to focus on jazz and blues is that they tend to have a very different approach to endings. Okay, in particular, there's less of a focus on ending on a clear tonic. Now, we'll think about the differences between jazz and blues endings in a second, yeah, but the styles are quite closely related. So for now, let's say that we've got a song, we've got the chord progression for a song that we can treat either in a jazz or blues style, and it's in C major, and it ends with a 2-5-1. So that would probably be written down in our progression as something like D minor 7, G7, C. Now, because of jazz and blues being what they are, those chords would get altered. For a jazzy sound, we will probably do something like D minor 9, G7, add 6 with a flat ninth, and finish on something like C major 9 with an added 6. Okay. Really cool jazzy sound. If we wanted a more bluesy sound, then we might go for something like D minor 7, F9 over G, and finish on a C7. Very, very distinctive part of the blues there, that kind of that dominant 7 ending. We might even go for a tritone substitution. D minor 7, D flat 7 over G, to C major 7. The important thing, the key takeaway there, especially if you're unfamiliar with jazz and blues and cocktail or all of those styles, are those kind of concepts of chord extension and substitution. Yeah. If you're new to those, I've got a lot of tutorials that can help you with that stuff. Do go and check out my channel. Now, what those three variations of the 2-5-1 that I was playing there have in common, apart from the fairly lavish amount of substitution and extension, is the absence of a very straightforward tonic at the end. Okay, none of them just finished on a straight C chord. The jazz version I played finished on that. Yeah, so C major 9 with an added 6, and the blues version finished on the straight up C7. Okay, so many jazz songs in major keys you end on the 7th or the 9th or some variety of it, and blues endings, and these do crop up in jazz sometimes, yeah, very often have that minor 7, that flat 7, okay? You might get other stuff in there, you might get a 9th or other things like that. The key point is that neither of those styles are finishing on a really clear tonic chord. Blues and jazz do use ritenuto, by the way, but in, again, a very different way from the approach pop piano tends to take. Often it's kind of barely perceptible, yeah, often it's very, very tight and disciplined, and sometimes it's, especially on the final chord, it's really long and drawn out. So quite a common approach, in blues, for example, is to play in really strict time right to the end, and then go absolutely crazy on a final chord. Okay, so not really a ritenuto, it's almost like a little one chord coda stuck on the end there, but that's a very kind of common approach to listen out for. Finally, it's also worth saying that jazz and blues often use kind of stylized endings, especially traditional jazz or swing or stuff from the kind of mid-20th century. So I played an example a minute or two ago with that C, C7, F, F minor. But there are loads of different examples. Okay, and it's very much a case, if you're into those genres, of listening out for them because they crop up a lot and trying to work them out for yourselves. It's a very kind of common, almost cliched approach, but the fact that it's a cliche is kind of what makes it fun, if you see what I mean. Okay, so that's about it for another tutorial. I hope it was useful. Elizabeth, thanks very much for the question. I really hope I managed to answer it for you, yeah? If anyone else has any questions, just stick them in the comments threads underneath any of my tutorials, yeah? I always try to answer questions. Sometimes it takes me a little while, but I always try to. And if you ask me a really good question that I think a lot of people will find useful, then I will try to make a tutorial in response to it. Okay. Check out my social media: Facebook, Twitter, and now Instagram. Yeah, I'm trying to do more musical stuff on Instagram. Instagram.com/Bill Hilton, and also my books: How to Really Play the Piano, 7 Studies in Pop Piano, and An Introduction to Pop Piano, which, if you like this stuff, you might find useful. There are links to all of those in the description text right underneath this tutorial. Okay, so there we go. If you're not subscribed to the channel, hit the red subscribe button, and hopefully I'll see you next time.